So what we're trying to do with all these lectures is, we're trying to kind of take these notions that you've probably heard of before, like in this case, the fact that there's a federal deficit and a very large national debt, and we just basically want to provide the facts, have something that we can base an opinion off of that we form, and this one's really no different. Um, the key concept here would be that the government basically spends money and it earns money through taxes. So you have a difference typically between the amount spent versus the amount collected in taxes, which gives a rise to an annual deficit or surplus. When you add up those deficits over time, that's where you get the national debt. Okay, so let's look at what that debt level would be. There's this clock up there. It's going to look like a big hot mess. Not this one. This one. Look at that. That is messy. And what I want you to do is see that the US national debt, which is up here, is a lot of money. It is $29 trillion. As a percent of GDP, it's 127%. So it's larger than the annual production in the economy. This debt is created by a national deficit. That deficit, let's try to find it in this mess of stuff right here. Can you find it? I don't find a deficit here. Now, this is made by an organization, this clock. It's made by a group which thinks that we're spending too much money. And it thinks that, and in the way that you see that it thinks that is in the numbers it tries to highlight. You see that a little bit kind of over here where it says like food stamp recipients, that we have 42 million people that need food stamps, that we have 83 million people that are collecting Medicaid, 62 million people that are collecting Medicare. Yeah, that's, expensive. But how expensive is it really? So if we look at the largest budget items, again, Medicare and Medicaid together are a little bit larger than what's spent on Social Security. And these two together make up about 50% of the spending. About $1.2 trillion on Medicare and Medicaid, and about $1.1 trillion on Social Security. Add that to the 720 billion that's spent on national defense, and then 423 million just to keep our debtors off our back and just pay the interest. That's pretty bad. What's kind of cool is that we can actually look at Hawaii here. We can see that for our small chain of islands, we have about 1.5 million people. Obviously, most of those individuals living on Oahu. And of that 1.5 million people, that we've got about 1 in 7 are collecting food stamp recipients. So we have about 205,000 who need food stamps. That the government is earning as revenue right now about 17 about $17 billion, and yet spending as a state about $19 billion, thus generating a debt. That debt, as we see here, has grown to almost an entire year's worth of spending. So it's at about $18 billion. And as a share of the GDP for the state, which is at about $93 billion, the debt to GDP ratio is about 20%. Now let's look at a state that's much worse. Illinois being a classic example. So here for Illinois, it has a lot more people. It has 12 times the people. And so thus the debt is much larger, $166 billion, over 10 times larger, almost 10 times larger. Um, but the economy is larger. It's almost $1 trillion in size. So the debt to GDP ratio stays pretty constant. Okay, let's go back to the slides. So the deficits emerge when we spend more than we capture in tax revenue. The surplus emerges when we bring in more than we spend. And the debt is the addition, adding up um, all of the deficits from various years. So the off budget items, when we think about what is off budget, something is off budget, then it's considered separate from the normal budget bills. Um, these are programs generally that don't need a standalone appropriation because they have ways of capturing revenue themselves, like Social Security. Social Security has a trust fund. It has a trust fund, as we will see in later chapters. It has a trust fund that's generated by the fact that we all pay various taxes. And that money is then used to pay out the benefits. Medicare, we all pay Medicare premiums. We pay those Medicare premiums as we're working. And then you've even got some programs like the post office, which obviously collects money for stamps and stuff like that, but then also spends the money as well. Um, this process isn't that different even for the state level. So, for instance, um, we capture revenue from tuition, yet we also receive some money from the state government as a whole. We're largely off budget. On budget, the like for instance the public schools, like DOE, like the grade schools, those are all on budget because they don't charge tuition. They have no way of capturing money. All of their money comes from the general tax revenue that's captured. Um, we've almost always had a deficit and a debt, so it's not like we just all of a sudden became reckless with our spending. We've almost always had debt. Um, with the first debt coming from us fighting for our independence. The problem with that debt, the biggest problem with that debt, was that the United States did not have um, a credit score, basically. there was no legitimacy, there was no expectation that we would ever pay it back or not. Back in the day, so this had been the 1770s. Um, the problem was that you didn't have credit scores, so you had no way of knowing. Um, you had no way of knowing um, what you had no way of knowing that the United States was going to be able to pay it back. Plus, why would you want to lend money to a group that you didn't know if they were going to survive, right? The colonial individuals in the United States. So, um, John Adams, who was the second president of the United States, and in my opinion, is probably the most underappreciated of the founding fathers of the United States. John Adams had to go to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, and basically beg for credit. Actually, I think. Um, um, yeah, it's only a minute. We can do that. So this is Paul Giamatti, the actor. He's acting as John Adams here, and he's meeting the Dutch, who are the ones who he's supposed to get the money from. Let's put on the closed captionings that way. That way you can read it. Between the republics of the Netherlands and the United States. And those are basically the individuals, the Dutch, that have to provide the money. The Dutch first gave asylum to the Pilgrims. New York and New Jersey were first settled by your countrymen. May I remind you that the Netherlands were a republic long before America was even an idea. Indeed, sir. If I may, America and Holland are so close in history, in religion, in government, that any Dutchman instructed in the subject must pronounce the American Revolution just and necessary, or cast censure on the greatest actions of his immortal ancestors. How much money do you seek, Mr. Adams? An initial loan of $10 million. Bescheiden verzoek. Bescheiden man. Okay, so right, so basically, the entire country actually depended on this on getting this money. I don't know if this is the next scene. No, I don't think so. Uh, John Adams rips Alexander Hamilton a new one. Um, yeah, um, we owe actually a great deal to John Adams. Um, in terms of that national of that debt of $75 million. It wasn't just the federal government that had that debt; it was the individual states, and it was Alexander Hamilton's idea that when the country then became a United States, that the United States took on the individual states' debts. It brought the states closer to the entire country. Um, And then basically, the next few decades, the first decades of the United States, was all spent trying to um, pay down that balance. Um, Unfortunately, the United States was growing quite a bit in the beginning. And so, um, we didn't have Republicans, but basically, all the money that's being spent, um, most of the time, we've had deficits rather than surpluses. Um, Yet the debt, just because the scale of the funding wasn't that large, the debt did become smaller. Such as we can see here in the last bullet point, it did get pretty low. The national debt did get pretty low. I don't think. Let's look at the data here. This will only take us to 1966, unfortunately. Well, dude, you can see that obviously the debt has grown quite a bit. Now, the debt grew dramatically once we fought the Civil War. The Civil War being very expensive, and then we spent more decades after the Civil War was fought, paying down that debt all the way until um, all the way until World War One. In World War One, we got a lot of debt in World War One, and in fact, we've actually never paid off that debt. Largely, what we do these days is we actually just refinance the original debt that we had in World War One. And what's interesting as well is that the Civil War was actually the time that the bonds were then widely circulated. Um, so you actually had individuals owning the debt. So once World War II happened, that was just very expensive war, and the debt obviously grew quite a bit. And then the difference with World War One, starting with World War One and then continued with World War Two, is that the U.S. lost any sense that they had to pay off this debt. So rather than the debt going down over time after a war, now it just increased dramatically. And you see that. Um, what's amazing is that in 2019 the debt was 22 trillion. Let's go back to that. The debt clock time machine. Uh, okay, so let's try to remember this. 29 trillion. And in 1980, it wasn't even $1 trillion. So I don't want to say that 1980 was a simpler time. Yet at the same time, the debt to GDP ratio wasn't that large, 35%. By 1990, 55%, with almost 3 trillion in debt. By 2000, a little bit larger, 61%. Now keep that in mind right there. Right, the Clinton administration, which is largely takes over most of the 90s, you actually don't see the debt growing that much in terms of percent of debt to GDP. Yet the debt itself had grown to almost $6 trillion. And then here's where things get a little political because now they're not doing decades, now they're doing political presidential administrations. Let's just look at 2012 since it'll be after the 2008 crisis. Yeah, $14 trillion. Now your debt to GDP ratio being almost 100%. Um, there's some ways that the debt and deficit might not be as bad as we think it is. One of the reasons why is because, generally speaking, it's not adjusted for inflation. So um, it may not be that bad. In fact, if we look at the chart, If we look at the real um, deficit, um, the real deficit really didn't become a significant problem until the 2008 crisis. And then it just required a lot of spending. And it's during the Obama administration that things are largely kind of recovering. And then, you get this sense then that at least during the beginnings of the Trump administration, we had some reversion back to a larger deficit in real terms. The data here only takes us out to here. I'm not sure that Fred captures this. Let's see if it does. Mm, no, I don't think it. Yeah, it doesn't capture it in real terms. Okay. Um, for whatever reason, I know it's kind of convenient to. Um, I'm just going to jump to the slide and I'll just talk about it. I know it's convenient to focus on this like 100% ratio and say like um, once the deficit is as large as the debt, then things must be really, really bad. Um, or sorry, the debt to the GDP. In terms of the deficit to GDP, we don't want that to be large either. But at the same time, you know, one of the things that the only thing that really matters is are we able to pay it off? Does it really matter that we're borrowing so much if we can pay it off? And I don't think there's a lot of question that the US, with all that it has, isn't able to pay off the deficit and the debt. Like, if we really wanted to, we could pay this off. The problem is that it would require a lot of sacrifice. And again, no one's going to get reelected if we're making sacrifice. So we end up continuing the deficit and continuing the debt because really the only burden of this debt is the interest payments. And we seem to be able to make the interest payments just fine. The problem is that we're not paying off the principal, meaning the amount that we originally borrowed. Um, Additionally, economists think it's important that we separate what we're spending the money on. If we're spending if the government is spending money on things that are being used right away, let's say like disaster relief or things like that, that's very different than the federal government spending money to build a power plant or to build a water treatment plant or to build a bridge. That's considered part of the capital budget. So sometimes there's a good reason to be taking on more of a deficit and be contributing to the debt. And that would be more if you're doing things for capital reasons rather than operating reasons. And the reason why is that spending on capital goods generally helps the economy grow faster. So then what that means is that we need to start to think about how does the deficit look differently um, based on where we are in the business cycle, and also how much of it is because we made a specific decision to spend the money, so like basically discretionary spending, versus what's automatically being spent. So the cyclical deficit, that's the deficit going up or down, going up because we're in a recession, because we're obviously spending more Poverty programs are also collecting less in taxes, so the deficit grows during a recession, shrinks when the economy is doing well. The structural deficit refers to the fact that if the economy is, or if the budget is written in such a way that even when the economy is doing well, is at full employment, if we still have a deficit, then the budget itself is badly written. And I think most would argue is that we have a structural deficit in the United States. So we do really need to have some hard conversations about how to fix the budget. And then the other part of this, again, is the functional finance. That would be the discretionary spending to basically get out of a crisis, that stimulus package. And we obviously saw a lot of that during COVID. Okay, I'm going to pause it right here. Okay, so to resume here. Um, so if we look at um, the debt as a percentage of the GDP, we see that it's growing and that it's reached that kind of magical number of being over 100% once again. I mean, the last time we were at that point was during World War II. So obviously, we're not fighting a two front battle anymore. Now we're just spending beyond our means. And it's obviously been growing dramatically, much faster than the GDP has been growing. Again, I'm not too entirely certain that we need to be too concerned about it because the main question is can we pay it off or not? And again, we seem to be able to pay off the debt. But also, what's important to note here is who do we owe the money to? It turns out, and you kind of see that in this graph here, is that we mostly owe the money to ourselves. That in fact, the largest holder of US government debt is the Social Security Trust Fund. Um, it is required by law to hold US government debt. So, is it really something to be worried about? Really, all it is the future generation of Americans um, having to pay off for the spending that the current generation is doing. Um, it's unfair to the other generation, but it is what it is. Now, let's look at this debt level that we hold in the US and compare it to other countries. Well, it's actually a pretty global phenomenon. All countries, for the most part, have been spending more, with the notable exception of Germany. Germany is the global exception. Um, uh, it's um, my family, grandparents, so not my parents, but my grandparents are all from Germany. And there, saving money is just ingrained in the culture. Um, because of the problem that happened in the 1920s with the hyperinflation um, that led eventually to the rise of the Nazi Party and Hitler, um, is that there's never a desire to return to that point. So the idea was don't overspend, don't overspend. And you see that it is the European exception, and it's even the global exception to the rule that they've kept debt as a percent of GDP largely stable. Um, and if we look at if we look at from the World Bank perspective, if we look at that debt, which is centrally held, we still see that German exception here. Okay. Um, The problem again with much of the debt going on is that so much of this is generational. That's really the thing that we do need to be most concerned about, is that essentially um, the debt that we hold has to be paid off by the next generation. And so there is kind of an unfairness to what we're doing. Um, and we see that here in terms of who owns the debt. That a large chunk of the debt is held by the Social Security and the Medicare trust funds. Um, in fact, I'm not sure if it tracks this here, but let's just see if it does. I'm not sure it captures it. Uh, I don't think this is what I want. No. Let's look at the trust fund data here from the. Um, so here, like I told you, Social Security is required by law to buy U.S. government debt. So basically, with every paycheck that you pay in for FICA, the that tax is collected by the federal government, and the government basically, or Social Security basically, is required to buy U.S. government debt. Now, I don't want you to think that that's not important, and this is one of the questions that's asked here. Um, the fact that the Social Security has to buy U.S. government debt doesn't make it worthless, as kind of is said here. Um, it's a real security. Now, you may not agree that it should be holding bonds. Maybe you think it should be holding stocks. That's a different issue altogether. Um, the trust fund itself does hold a real asset. It's just unfortunate that um, asset is now shrinking in size because we're now spending more than we are taking in. Yes, it is true that there are other countries that hold our debt, yet that amount is not very large. And um, right now, in fact, actually, I just read an article in Business Week this week. It was actually really interesting. Um, I don't think I can get. Um, it's a really good article. Um, it's a little bit old here. If not, I'll have to find it, and then it'll take forever. Sorry, let me just see a little bit longer here. I can't find it. Yeah, never mind. Um, it was basically an article though about how the Federal Reserve really this is trying to make a projection out to 2024, and it has not ended up being true because it actually turns out that the Federal Reserve now has recaptured a much larger share of the debt that greatly exceeds trust funds now. You won't see that in this data. I don't know why they don't dashed lines here because these are just projections of what's going on. That's not actually what happened, though. And what we can see is that our debt is increasingly being held by others overseas. Um, but you shouldn't look at the debt as just being held by China or something like that. Like, let's not let's not misinterpret the facts here. Our debt, yes, there's a sizable amount that's held by China, that's held by Japan, but by no means is that the overwhelming influence in the economy. Now, the last thing I'll say, and I'm not going to cover the last slide, so this is the last slide that I want to cover. I am not in favor of the balanced budget amendment. So the idea with the balanced budget amendment is that some people think that we should pass a law that requires the budget to be balanced. Yes, as the second bullet point highlights, you wouldn't want that necessarily because you want, from a Keynesian perspective, you actually do want the government to spend more money when the economy is not doing well, just at the time when you'd be running a deficit. My disagreement with it, yes, exists there on a theoretical level, but I just I think it's unfair to spend our time focusing on an amendment to the Constitution for something like this when there's a lot of other things that haven't that don't have a constitutional amendment. For instance, and again, you can disagree with me. I don't care. I mean, we all have our own beliefs. I just don't think that if we can't pass a constitutional amendment, for instance, that gives women specifically equal rights to men, I'm not sure we should be wasting our time on a balanced budget amendment. If we can't pass a constitutional amendment where we either um, you know let's say take a stand on other controversial issues such as abortion. Do we want to say it's prohibited or do we want to say it's permitted? Right now we just have a right Roe v. Wade kind of a court case kind of thing. You probably want to have a constitutional amendment where you get a little bit more clarity and a little bit more permanency. And that's just two issues, right? And obviously I picked ones that are a little bit more gender oriented, but right, we could talk about things like the Second Amendment, right? Do we need to think about gun rights? We could talk about even things like just a number of elements of the Constitution that we could revisit. So why are we wasting our time on this, on a balanced budget amendment? Because that, for a congressperson, is that what they should be wasting their time on, or what we as the public should be wasting our time on? It seems like there's more important issues to be concerned about than this. That's my thought. Okay.